Congressman Hynes, we have no intelligence from the administration tonight on what happened. Absolutely none. All we have is Donald Trump saying all is well. So far, so good.
Yeah, that's right. Although I will tell you, it's too early to know for sure, but indications are that the damage was not overly severe. I suspect that if we'd had a catastrophe in terms of casualties, the president would have known about it a long time ago and probably wouldn't have sent out the tweet that he did. So I don't usually do this, and I'm not sure I've ever done it in the many years that I've watched the Middle East very carefully. But this may be a remarkably positive opening in what I thought was going to be a period of a couple of weeks in which the Congress of the United States, the people of the United States, and the president were going to be involved in a slippery slide to what could be a disastrous war. But maybe, just maybe, Lawrence, based on the tweets, can't believe I'm saying that we saw from the president of the United States and from Foreign Minister Zarif, both of which were optimistic, both of which were calm and carefully worded. Maybe both sides stared into the abyss and said, let's figure out a way to step back from what could have been a very ugly situation for both sides.
So you're taking some encouragement or hope in the Iranian foreign minister when he tweeted tonight, we do not seek escalation or war, but we'll defend ourselves against any aggression. That line about we do not seek escalation or war, that's what signals that this could be the end.
Well, actually, Lawrence, the word in that tweet that matters the most to me is the word concluded. That's the third word in that tweet. We took and concluded. Now, maybe that's not true. The Iranians are not often honest in the way they project themselves abroad. But that word concluded suggests that maybe what we've seen, and again, let's keep praying that no one died in the attack on al-Assad. But that word concluded suggests that they are saying we did what you knew we had to do. There was no way the Iranian regime was not going to retaliate here, but that now we're done. That gives us an opportunity. And look, I'm not in the habit of praising Donald Trump, and I think we're in this very scary situation because I'm not sure he thought through what he was doing. But even his tweet, which was optimistic, which was unusually carefully worded, again, this is a moment where maybe we can step back from the abyss. Remember, Lawrence, there's 1,000 scenarios far, far worse. And again, I want to say we don't know that everyone is safe in al-Assad. But look, the Iranians could have committed an atrocious terrorist attack in a Western European city. They could have attacked Israel. They could have, attacked the Fifth Fleet that we have in Bahrain. That did not happen. And I'm not used to having outcomes that are perhaps surprisingly measured and better than expected in this region of the world.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.